Welcome to Law in Layers, where we break down the law one layer at a time. Today, we'll be breaking down the basics of unlawful act manslaughter. This is a form of involuntary manslaughter, which occurs when the defendant causes the death of another person but does not possess the mens rea required for murder. Instead, criminal liability arises because the death results from the defendant's unlawful conduct. As established in Larkin, unlawful act manslaughter arises where the defendant intentionally commits an unlawful act which a reasonable person would recognize as exposing another person to the risk of some harm, and the victim dies as a result. In DPP v Newbury and Jones, Lord Salmon identified 4 elements of unlawful act manslaughter which the prosecution must prove to secure a conviction. 1. The act must be unlawful. 2. The act must be dangerous. 3. The act must cause the death, and finally, 4. The defendant must intentionally do an act. The first 3 elements in this criterion constitute the actus reus of the offence, whereas the final element constitutes the mens rea. The first element is that the defendant must commit an unlawful act. This must be a criminal offence and not merely a civil wrong, as seen in R.V. Franklin. In this case, the defendant took a box from a stall on Brighton Pier and threw it into the sea. Unbeknownst to him, a swimmer was underneath in the water. The box struck and killed the swimmer. The prosecution argued that the defendant was committing the civil wrong of trespass to property and that, regardless of negligence, he should be guilty of manslaughter because a death resulted from this wrongful act. The court rejected this argument. Justice Matthew ruled that a mere civil wrong cannot form the basis of a conviction for unlawful act manslaughter. It must also be stated that the defendant must engage in a positive act, as an omission will not suffice. This can be seen in R.V. Lowe, where the defendant failed to call a doctor to attend his seriously ill child. The prosecution could not charge the defendant with unlawful act manslaughter because the case was based on an omission rather than a positive act. The second element considers whether the defendant's actions were dangerous. Dangerousness is tested objectively. In R.V. Church, it was stated that dangerous means that all sober and reasonable people would recognize at least the risk of some harm, albeit not serious harm. The reasonable person is deemed to have the knowledge that the defendant had, or ought to have had, at the time of the offense, as demonstrated in R.V. Dawson. In this case, the defendants used imitation firearms while robbing a petrol station. The victim suffered a heart attack and died. The defendants were not guilty of unlawful act manslaughter because they were unaware of the victim's heart condition, and a reasonable person with the same knowledge would not have foreseen the risk of some physical harm. The third element is that the unlawful act must cause the victim's death. Causation is the link between the defendant's conduct and the resulting death. There are 2 types of causation: factual causation and legal causation. Factual causation considers whether the defendant was the factual cause of the victim's death. This is established using the but-for test, as seen in R.V. White. In this case, the defendant attempted to poison his mother, but she died from a heart attack before the poison could take effect. Therefore, but for the defendant's actions, she still would have died, meaning he was not the factual cause of her death. Legal causation considers whether the defendant was a substantial cause of the victim's death. This is established using the de minimis principle. This principle states that the defendant's actions need not be the sole or main cause of death, provided they were more than a minimal cause of death. This can be seen in R.V. Paget. The defendant shot at a police officer who was attempting to arrest him and used a pregnant teenage girl as a human shield. The officer returned fire, killing the girl. Although the defendant did not fire the fatal shot, he was held to be the legal cause of her death because he had set in motion the chain of events that led to her death. It was foreseeable that the police would return fire. Therefore, even though he was not the physical cause of death, his actions were a substantial cause. In any case, it must be considered whether the chain of causation has been broken by a Novus Actus interveniens, also known as a new intervening act. There are generally 2 types: medical negligence and the victim's own actions. When it comes to medical negligence, the courts are reluctant to find that it constitutes a new intervening act. This was demonstrated in R.V. Smith, where the court held that if the original injuries remain the operating and substantial cause of death, the defendant will still be held liable, regardless of any medical negligence. However, in R.V. Jordan, the medical treatment was so palpably wrong that the defendant was no longer the cause of the victim's death. In this extreme case, the victim's stab wounds were healing well, but doctors administered a drug to which he was known to be allergic and gave excessive intravenous fluids. The victim died from complications caused by the medical treatment rather than from the stab wound itself. A victim's own actions can also constitute a Novus Actus interveniens. This is assessed using the daftness test. If the victim's response is proportionate and reasonably foreseeable, the defendant remains liable. However, if the reaction is so daft or irrational that no reasonable person could have foreseen it, the chain of causation will be broken. An example of this principle can be found in Roberts, where the defendant made unwanted sexual advances towards the victim while driving. To escape, she jumped from the moving vehicle. The court held that her reaction was proportionate and foreseeable. Therefore, the chain of causation was not broken, and the defendant remained liable for her injuries. A similar principle was applied in R.V. Williams and Davis. In that case, the victim jumped from a moving car and died after being threatened by the defendants. The court established that if a victim's escape response is panicked but remains within the range of reasonableness in response to an immediate threat, it will not be considered daft, and the defendant will remain liable. It must also be remembered that a defendant must take their victim as they find them. This is known as the thin skull, or eggshell skull, rule. If the victim's injuries are made worse because of a pre-existing condition, the defendant remains liable for the resulting harm. An example is Hayward, where a husband and wife argued, leading to the husband chasing his wife into the street while shouting threats. During the altercation, the wife collapsed and died. Unknown to either party, she suffered from a thyroid condition that made her particularly susceptible to death from fright or shock when combined with physical exertion. The husband was therefore liable for her death. The rule also applies to religious beliefs, as demonstrated in R.V. Blau. The victim refused a blood transfusion because she was a Jehovah's Witness and later died. The defendant remained liable because he had to take the victim as he found her, including her religious beliefs. The fourth element is whether the defendant has the mens rea for the unlawful act. For example, in DPP v. Newbury and Jones, the defendants, both teenage boys, threw a piece of paving stone from a railway bridge onto a train passing beneath them. The object struck and killed the guard who was sitting in the driver's compartment. The defendants were convicted of manslaughter and unsuccessfully appealed on the ground that they had not foreseen that their actions might cause harm to another person. Their convictions were upheld because they possessed the mens rea for the underlying offence of criminal damage. This case confirms that the defendant only needs the mens rea for the base unlawful act, not for the resulting death or any harm caused, as the test is objective. If the prosecution can prove all four elements of unlawful act manslaughter, the defendant will be found guilty. Unlawful act manslaughter is an indictable-only offence and carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment, although sentencing ultimately remains at the discretion of the court. Thank you for watching Law in Layers. If you found this video helpful, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time as we continue to understand the law, one layer at a time.